excited, dramatic tone. You have some nerve, don't you? The crowd falls silent. The air is thick with tension. The host, smug, overconfident, leans back in his chair, unfazed. He thinks he's in control. But Morgan Freeman? Oh, he's about to remind everyone why he's a legend. It started like any other talk show. Cameras rolling, the audience clapping, and the host eager to make headlines. He thought he could get under Morgan's skin. He interrupted him, threw in snide remarks, and even chuckled at his own jokes, none of them funny. Morgan, ever the gentleman, let it slide. At first, he nodded, smiled that slow, knowing smile, but then the host crossed the line. So, Morgan, the host sneered. People say your voice could make a shopping list sound profound. But honestly, does it ever get tiring? Just talking? Laughter rippled through the audience, but it wasn't the good kind. It was uneasy, awkward. A few people exchanged glances. The host was trying too hard. Morgan leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. His eyes, sharp, steady, locked onto the host's. And then in that deep, unmistakable voice he said, "You know, silence is a powerful thing. You should try it sometime." The room froze. The smirk on the host's face twitched. He opened his mouth, then shut it. The audience? Dead quiet. Everyone was waiting. Morgan continued, his voice smooth but firm. "I've spent my life telling stories, not just with words, but with meaning, with respect. That's the difference between talking and being heard." The host shifted in his seat. No cue cards could save him now. "You came here for entertainment," Morgan went on, "but conversation isn't a game. If you listen, really listen, you might learn something about the world, about people, about yourself." The silence stretched. The weight of his words hung in the air. And then, applause. Slow at first, then thunderous. The audience was on their feet. They had just witnessed a masterclass in grace and wisdom. The host? He managed a weak chuckle. "Well, Morgan, I guess that's why they call you the best." Morgan leaned back, a small smile playing on his lips. "I don't need to be the best," he said. "I just need to be heard." The applause still echoed through the studio, but the host, he wasn't smiling anymore. His confidence had cracked just slightly. He cleared his throat, shifting his cue cards as if they held an escape route. "So," he said, forcing a chuckle, "I guess that's your way of saying I should shut up?" Morgan raised an eyebrow, amused but unimpressed. "Not at all," he replied smoothly. "Talking is easy. Saying something worth listening to, that's the real challenge." The audience murmured in agreement. The host, desperate to regain control, leaned forward with a grin. "All right, Mr. Freeman. Since you seem to have all the wisdom in the world, what's the best advice you've ever been given?" Without missing a beat, Morgan answered, "Never raise your voice when you can raise your words." Another wave of silence. Another moment of realization. The host swallowed, suddenly very aware that he was outmatched in every way. He looked around, searching for an easy way out, but Morgan wasn't done. "You see, respect isn't about how loud you are or how many people you can impress in a room," he said, his voice softer now but no less commanding. "It's about understanding that every person you speak to has a story, just like you." He glanced at the audience, letting his gaze settle on different faces. The difference between a great storyteller and someone just making noise? One speaks to be remembered, the other speaks to be noticed. The audience erupted again, this time not just in applause but in admiration. The host, out of words, out of comebacks, finally leaned back in his chair and nodded. "Well, Morgan," he said, quieter now, "I think I just learned something." Morgan smiled, a twinkle of wisdom in his eyes. "Then my job here is done." And with that he leaned back, relaxed, as if he had never been challenged at all. The host, now humbled, glanced down at his notes. Pointless now. He had planned for witty banter, maybe a few jokes at Morgan's expense, but what he got was something else entirely. Something real. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a small smile. "You know, Morgan," he admitted, "I came into this thinking I was the one running the show." Morgan chuckled, that deep, resonant sound that made the room feel warmer. "Oh, you are," he said, leaning in slightly. "I just reminded you what a real conversation looks like." The audience roared, some clapping, some laughing, all of them fully engaged. Even the host couldn't help but grin. The tension that had once thickened the air was gone, replaced by something else. Respect, understanding, maybe even admiration. The host sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he said. "Before I embarrass myself any further, let me ask you one last thing." Morgan gestured for him to continue. "If you could give one piece of advice to everyone watching right now, something to take home with them, what would it be?" Morgan paused, thoughtful. Then, with the same calm authority that had just dismantled an entire ego, he said, "Be careful with your words. They can cut deeper than any blade, or heal wounds no doctor can reach. The choice is yours." The audience was silent, hanging onto every syllable. The host, for the first time that night, didn't try to be funny. He simply nodded. "That," he said, "is the best answer I've ever heard." Morgan gave a slow nod as if to say, "Lesson learned." The camera zoomed out, the applause swelled, and in that moment everyone knew. This wasn't just another interview. It was a master class in grace, wisdom, and the undeniable power of words. The applause slowly faded. The host let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The energy in the room had shifted. What started as a typical late-night interview had turned into something unforgettable, something that would be replayed, quoted, and remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The host, no longer hiding, behind his usual bravado, leaned forward, genuine curiosity in his eyes. "Morgan," he said, "I have to ask, where does that wisdom come from? Is it life experience, the roles you've played, or have you always been this insightful?" Morgan smiled, folding his hands together. His voice, as always, was steady, measured. "Think wisdom comes from listening," he said. "Not just hearing, but truly listening. To people, to life, to the moments in between words." The host nodded, absorbing the lesson in real time. "You see," Morgan continued, "most people go through life waiting for their turn to speak. They don't really hear what's being said. But if you stop, if you really listen, you'll find that the world has been teaching you something all along." A soft murmur ran through the audience, as if they too had just realized how often they spoke without listening. The host sat back, letting the words settle in. Then, with a chuckle, he said, "I feel like I should be paying tuition for this interview. This is like a life lesson disguised as a talk show." Morgan let out a deep, amused laugh. "Well," he said, "education comes in many forms. Some lessons are taught in classrooms, others in conversations." The host nodded. "And tonight I think we all just got a lesson we won't forget." The audience erupted into applause once more. This time, not out of obligation, but out of sheer admiration. As the cameras panned out, the host turned to Morgan one last time. "Mr. Freeman, I started this interview thinking I'd entertain the audience, but somehow you ended up doing something much more powerful. You made them think." Morgan gave a slow nod, his signature half-smile appearing once more. "That," he said, "was the point all along." The screen faded to black, and in living rooms across the world, people sat in silence, reflecting on the words of a man who had just reminded them of the power of wisdom, patience, and above all, listening. As the credits rolled and the studio lights dimmed, the audience lingered in their seats, reluctant to leave. It wasn't just another talk show episode. It was a moment, the kind that sticks with you long after the noise dies down. Back on stage, the host stood up, extending a hand to Morgan. This time it wasn't the forced, TV-friendly handshake meant for the cameras. It was real. "You got me good tonight," the host admitted with a chuckle. "I came in thinking I'd get a few laughs at your expense, but instead, I got schooled." Morgan took his hand, shaking it firmly. "Nah," he said. "You just got reminded." "Reminded of what?" "That words matter, that people remember how you make them feel, and that respect earns more respect." The host exhaled, shaking his head. Damn. You really don't miss, do you? Morgan simply smiled. As they turned toward the backstage area, a producer rushed up, headset still on, clipboard in hand. Mr. Freeman, I just want to say, that was incredible. We've had a lot of guests, but I've never seen a moment like that before. Morgan gave a humble nod. Well, he said, sometimes people just need to be reminded of what really matters. The producer grinned. And what's that? Morgan paused, looking around at the lingering audience, the crew still frozen in admiration, the host still digesting the night's lesson. Then, in that deep, unmistakable voice, he said, that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one worth listening to. With that, he turned, walking toward the exit with the quiet confidence of a man who had said everything that needed to be said. And as the doors closed behind him, the world knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just another interview. It was a lesson that would echo long after the camera stopped rolling. As Morgan stepped out of the studio doors, the cool night air greeted him. He took a deep breath, unbothered by the flashing cameras of a few paparazzi waiting outside. A reporter rushed up, microphone in hand. Mr. Freeman, she called, slightly out of breath. That was, honestly, I don't think I've ever seen a talk show moment quite like that. You left the audience speechless. How does it feel to have that kind of impact? Morgan smiled, adjusting his coat. I don't aim to leave people speechless, he said. I just hope they walk away thinking a little differently than they did before. The reporter nodded, but before she could ask another question, a crew member from the studio, one of the younger production assistants, hurried outside, his expression a mix of excitement and nerves. Mr. Freeman, he called, slowing as he approached. I just wanted to say I've worked on this show for 2 years and I've seen a lot of interviews, but tonight, that was different. Morgan studied the young man for a moment, seeing something familiar in his eyes. And what made it different for you? He asked. The assistant hesitated, then spoke with sincerity. I guess I never really thought about the power of listening before. I mean, I always just saw conversations as a way to get my point across. But the way you handled that moment, how you didn't raise your voice, didn't try to win, you just spoke with purpose, it made me realize how much I talk without really saying anything. Morgan chuckled softly. Most people do. But recognizing that is the first step to changing it. The young man nodded. I just wanted to say thank you. That was more than just a TV moment. It was a lesson. Morgan patted him on the shoulder, his deep voice warm yet firm. You don't need a microphone or a camera to make an impact. Just make sure that when you do speak, it's worth listening to. The assistant swallowed hard, nodding with newfound determination. As Morgan walked away, slipping into the back seat of a waiting car, the studio lights still glowed behind him. The world would talk about what had just happened. It would be clipped, shared, debated. Some would call it a masterclass in humility. Others would say it was a takedown of arrogance. But for those who truly listened, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something far greater, a reminder, a lesson, and above all, proof that the right words, spoken with the right intent, could change everything. As Morgan's car pulled away from the studio, the city lights flickered past his window. He sat in silence, his hands resting calmly on his lap, lost in thought. He'd done countless interviews over the years, been asked the same questions, in 100 different ways. But tonight was different. The host had come in expecting an easy conversation, maybe a few jokes at Morgan's expense. Instead, he got something far more valuable, a lesson in humility, in wisdom, in the art of true conversation. Morgan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It was worn, the pages slightly curled from years of use. He flipped it open to a page filled with scribbled notes, thoughts, quotes, reminders he'd collected over time. He took a pen and slowly wrote down a single sentence. The most powerful voices are the ones that don't need to shout. He closed the notebook, letting the words settle. The car rolled to a stop at a red light. Outside on the sidewalk, he noticed a young woman sitting on a bench, her headphones in, completely absorbed in a book. A street performer strummed a guitar nearby, his voice soft but full of emotion. A businessman walked past, too busy on his phone to notice the world around him. Morgan smiled to himself. Everywhere stories were unfolding, some loud, some quiet, but all meaningful in their own way. As the car moved forward again, he leaned back, closing his eyes. He didn't need to say anything more. The world had heard him tonight, and if they were listening, truly listening, maybe, just maybe, they'd carry that lesson with them. As Morgan's car wove through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine and the distant city sounds filled the silence. He wasn't one for unnecessary words, but his mind was still turning. Not about the interview. No, that moment had already passed. He was thinking about what came next. He had spent his life telling stories, lending his voice to characters who left an impact, shaping narratives that made people feel, think, and reflect. But tonight had reminded him of something important. Sometimes the most powerful stories weren't in the movies or the scripted words of a narrator. Sometimes they happened in real time. The driver, an older man with silver-streaked hair, glanced at Morgan in the rearview mirror. "That was quite the show tonight," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of familiarity. Morgan cracked a small smile. "You were watching?" The driver chuckled. "I always watch when you're on. You don't just talk. You say something. And that host? Who?" Didn't know what hit him. Morgan shook his head lightly. "It was never about hitting him." The driver nodded knowingly. "Nah, I get it. You weren't trying to put him in his place. You were trying to show him there's a better place to be." Morgan looked out the window, watching the world blur past. "Something like that." The driver was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "You ever get tired of it?" Morgan turned back. "Tired of what?" "Being the voice of wisdom. Of always having the right thing to say. Of people expecting you to be the one with all the answers." Morgan exhaled slowly, considering the question. Then after a moment he said, "Wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing which questions are worth asking." The driver let that sit between them. Then, with a grin, he tapped the steering wheel. "See? That right there. That's why people listen when you talk." Morgan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Maybe, but I'd rather they listen when the world talks." The car pulled up to his home, a quiet, unassuming place fitting for a man who had nothing to prove. The driver put it in park and turned to face him. "Before you go," he said, "if you had one last piece of advice, not for a talk show host, not for a big audience, just for someone like me, what would it be?" Morgan studied the man for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "Never underestimate the power of silence. It teaches, it heals, and most importantly, it gives you time to truly hear what's being said." The driver nodded slowly, taking in the weight of those words. "I'll remember that." Morgan stepped out of the car, adjusting his coat as the night air wrapped around him. He gave the driver one last nod before heading inside. As the car drove away, disappearing into the night, Morgan Freeman did what he always did after a moment like this. He sat in the quiet, and he listened.